you coming up with it. But let me break it down to something even more fundamental than Supreme Court precedent that people can really grab hold of. Think about this. How many times have we seen reported on the news that somebody who was in the United States, who is here illegally, an undocumented immigrant, committed some horrendous crime, some violent crime? What happens? Well, the media picks up on it and the media begins following it. I will say that some of the right-leaning networks will really want to focus on it because they'll try to push the narrative that undocumented immigrants are really the bad people in the United States. And what do we then do? Well, we watch the court proceedings. We watch the preliminary hearings. We hear about the pretrial motions. We watch the trial itself if the trial is in a jurisdiction where it's televised. We wait for the verdict. We see what the sentence is. Guess what, Brian? If there were no due process rights available to those undocumented immigrants who committed those crimes and then were tried in accordance with all of the procedures and protections that American citizens enjoy, we wouldn't be watching those trials, and right-wing media wouldn't be focusing on those trials, would they? No, you could just summarily grab up and either, imprison or worse, or, deport or do whatever you want. Why? Because no due process rights would apply. So this is absolute stone-cold lies by Stephen Miller, and, you can see why he wants to put this garbage in the public square.
Glenn, Donald Trump had come out and said, basically, as his way to justify this mass deportation of folks without any due process, he said, well, if we do afford them their constitutionally protected rights of due process, then that's going to mean that we're going to have to go through millions of cases, and we couldn't possibly do that. And so that's why we have to engage in this process of really just deporting first, asking questions later, or more accurately, deporting first, apologizing later. And so what would your response be to Donald Trump, who says we couldn't possibly engage in the correct form of business because we just have to get this done? It would take too long to just have millions of court cases.
Yeah, my response is twofold, Brian. One, it may be inconvenient, it may be burdensome, it may be resource intensive to comply with the constitutional rights of human beings, but that doesn't mean Donald Trump says, you know what, it's just too damn inconvenient, so we're going to violate the Constitution. And my second response to Donald Trump is you do understand, because Brian, he has used the word trials over and over again. We'd have to give people hundreds of thousands of trials and we can't possibly do it. First of all, he's wrong. His frame of reference is for a criminal trial is what he had to endure because he committed and was
his own, right,
and convicted of 34 felony counts. That was a long, drawn-out process.
One which, by the way, he drew out on his own volition. The only reason it took that long is because that was his purposeful strategy to make sure it lasted as long as possible so that he could delay to the point where he actually got into office.
And he enjoyed all his due process rights and then some, didn't he?
Right.
But that's his frame of reference. That's why if he's not outright lying, intentionally and knowingly lying about this, then he doesn't understand that a deportation hearing, your notice and opportunity to be heard, is not a trial. It is something that can be done pretty quickly and expeditiously, like literally within a matter of weeks. Think about it. Some of the courts have ruled recently in the Venezuelan deportation cases that anybody that the Trump administration is seeking to deport gets at least 21 days advance notice that the Trump administration is trying to deport them so they can get a lawyer, get into court, and contest it. And a deportation hearing, Brian, can be done, within a matter of hours or days, perhaps weeks at the longest. So Donald Trump either is lying about his understanding of all of these people needing full-blown trials. They don't. This is something that can be done quickly, efficiently, expeditiously, and regardless of how long it takes. You don't get to say that fulfilling the rights that people enjoy under the Constitution is just a little too inconvenient for our tastes, so we'll go ahead and violate those rights.
Does having somebody like Stephen Miller or even Trump himself who are coming out and basically openly defying the Supreme Court, openly defying the law, openly defying the Constitution, perverting what all of this precedent actually says, does this have some type of atmospheric impact on the courts that are litigating this stuff, being able to see how the extent to which these people are operating in bad faith the extent to which they are so openly flouting these rulings being handed down, does that have some impact moving forward, whether it's with these trial courts or even the Supreme Court itself?
Brian, not only atmospheric, but evidentiary. And here's what I mean by that. When Donald Trump or his authorized representative, Stephen Miller, makes these claims, guess what? Those statements are admissible in court as statements of a party opponent. And believe me, all of the plaintiffs in the more than 200 cases that are involved in litigating against Donald Trump's lawlessness and unconstitutionality will package those statements up, introduce them into evidence, and figuratively cram them down the throats of Trump and his administration. And believe me, judges will take note. So I actually welcome all of these lies, this propaganda, this recklessness, this hateful, anti-democratic blather that Donald Trump and Stephen Miller are spitting out. We, you and me and independent media and hopefully legacy media, but I think the reason that we are here and thriving is because legacy media hasn't really focused on what's important. We need to highlight for all of the folks who are, viewing our Legal Breakdown segments and other independent media outlets that these things are lies, that the Supreme Court squarely contradicts Stephen Miller and Donald Trump. That's our job, but it is the court's job to hold Trump and the administration and Stephen Miller accountable for these lies and rule accordingly. And what we have seen, Brian, over and over and over again is that the federal courts, including on the due process front, the Supreme Court has been imminently up to the task.
Glenn, I want to throw your attention to a clip of Donald Trump speaking with Kristen Welker.
But even given those numbers that you're talking about, don't you need to uphold the Constitution of the United States as president?
I don't know. I have to respond by saying again, I have brilliant lawyers that work for me, and they are going to obviously follow what the Supreme Court said. What you said is not what I heard the Supreme Court said. They have a different interpretation.
So that was Kristen Welker asking Donald Trump if he has to uphold the Constitution. His response is, I don't know. He takes an oath to uphold the Constitution. It's literally his oath of office. And so in this same issue where he's asked about this idea of being able to afford these undocumented immigrants due process, which was already interpreted as being the law by the U.S. Supreme Court multiple times. We've spoken about that earlier in this episode. And so is there a case to be made right here that by virtue of basically coming forward and saying that he doesn't have to afford these undocumented immigrants any due process rights, and even that he's not sure if he has to uphold the Constitution, isn't he violating his own oath of office by virtue of doing these things?
Brian, it feels like this is a man who not only is unworthy of the office of the presidency, but who needs to be impeached and removed. I mean, I don't think he was absent on the day he was sworn in. And he took an oath to uphold the Constitution, and now he says, I don't know if I have to uphold the Constitution. But here is the thing. None of this is winning him any fans among the trial court judges, all of the federal trial court judges, the federal circuit courts of appeal, the appeals court judges, or the Supreme Court justices. And I'm really looking forward to some of these cases that are in litigation right now making their way up to the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court now has an embarrassment of riches of evidence of Donald Trump basically thumbing his nose at not only the Constitution, but federal court orders, including the Supreme Court's order to facilitate the return to the United States of somebody that the Trump administration unlawfully, unconstitutionally deported to El Salvador. So I think on the legal front, things will get worse and worse and worse for Donald Trump. Of course, does that mean he will get more and more desperate and dangerous? That's where I guess I would place my $1 max bet is on him continuing to both spin out of control and circle the drain.
Right. I completely agree. And it remains to be seen whether the Supreme Court is going to be willing to protect its own autonomy and to protect its own supremacy at the top of the judicial system, because Donald Trump is not going to facilitate the release of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, just, to point out one case in particular. And so whether they actually fight back and and look to preserve their own autonomy here remains to be seen. So we will, of course, continue to cover this stuff as it breaks. For those who are watching, if you'd like to support my work and Glenn's work, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal